Well, welcome back. In today's session, I'm going to be uh, focusing on the concept of estimating and how you should go about estimating what a property is worth. So let's say let's put this as a question. Um, hmm. So think about this question. What is a property worth? Uh, to answer this question, there has to be a way of discerning two things: the value of the property and the price of the property. The value has to be estimated. The price is simply um, decided by the market. The price usually is whatever a willing buyer and a willing seller are happy to transact at. That becomes the price. The value, on the other hand, so this in many ways you could say is objective, uh, and it's fixed, although subject to negotiation. But initially, the price is determinable because it's known. The agent selling the property says the property is worth, £120,000 or £1.2 million. It's objective and it's fixed, subject to negotiation. The value, on the other hand, is subjective. Um, it has to be estimated. And even when estimated, it's not necessarily conclusive because there are certain assumptions that are used to come up with that value. In any case, there are several approaches that can be uh, used to estimate. Now, keep note of this word. As I go forward in this series, one of the things that I hope I do not do is present a picture that is false. And one of the false pictures that can be presented is by saying a property is worth X. Usually, what we should say, and if I do make that mistake, I apologize in advance, but what I should say is that my estimate of the property is X. And in most cases, it's a range. What you have is a range of value because the intrinsic value of a property cannot be precisely determined because you're making certain assumptions about cash flow, about risk. You're making assumptions about growth, and therefore you should normally have a range of values rather than a fixed value. In any case, there are several approaches to estimate what a property is worth. I am going to focus on two. Just two. The first is what I call intrinsic valuation. That's the first. The second is what I call relative pricing. Only two methods. As we go forward, I'm going to break the relative pricing methodology into two alternative options. One of them is what we call the replacement cost approach, and the second is what I call the comparable sales approach. But at the core, you're doing two things. you're estimating the value of a property based on its intrinsic characteristics, or you're using a relative scaling measure applicable to several buildings, and you're using that as a standard, as a scale, to estimate what you believe the property is worth. This deals with value. This deals with more, because you're comparing. It tends to focus more on several characteristics. One of them being you're trying to price the property based on demand and supply, or you're trying to price what the property will be, what it would cost to reconstruct or replace the property. Again, that will depend on so many factors: availability of contractors, availability of land, the construction costs, things such as the depreciation rate, etc. Cost of labor, cost of material, all of those factors apply. In any case, the intrinsic valuation approach is my preferred approach. And when we use the intrinsic valuation, what we do is we estimate the property's value based on what the property can generate in free cash. Whereas when I use the relative pricing approach, I am estimating the property's fair market price relative to other properties by comparing the said property, the property I have in mind, comparing it to other properties of similar characteristics. Or, like I just explained, estimating the cost of reconstructing the property with similar characteristics. And keep those two definitions close to your mind, because as we move forward, I'm going to expand on both in more detail. Now, let me begin by saying this. Think about this concept. You have a building, and let's say this building is a lovely Georgian country home. This is the buyer, and this is the seller. They come to an agreement on a price. And therefore, whenever you have an arrangement like this, where a buyer and a seller decide to transact, and once money is exchanged, what tends to happen is that the buyer exchanges cash for the property in the expectation, or with the expectation, that the value of the property over the period of ownership, whether the property is to be used as a home or whether the property will be used for rental purposes or for income, the buyer assumes that the free cash flow the property will generate over its entire duration, or for the timeline under which the new owner will keep it, he assumes that the total cash flow generated will exceed the price he paid. But for him to come to this conclusion, and this is where I start to bring in some interesting concepts, the first thing he has to do, or she has to do, is bring in something that we call the time value of money. Now, this is something I know that you are familiar with. Maybe not the concept from a definitional perspective, but from an understanding perspective. Let me expand on that. Both of us, you and I, know that if I asked you for £100, in December, 2021, and if I came to you in December 2029 and I returned that £100 back to you, you would know that in 2029, the £100 I return does not have the same purchasing power as when you gave me the money. But if we had an agreement that I would return the money back to you in 2029, one of the things you would want to do is ask yourself the question, I have to wait 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I get my money back. In order for me to wait this long, I need a compensation, some compensation to ensure that my money retains its value. So you might say, well, I'm happy to give you £100 today, but in 2029, I would want you to return back to me £139, such that in 2029, when you give me the £129, if I were to discount the money back till 2021, it would be equal to £100 plus whatever risk premium that I was happy to accept for delaying gratification. So the free cash flow the property generates over its entire lifetime, the methodology of estimating what that free cash flow would be requires that you incorporate the time value of money into your calculation procedure, and that you do that by discounting, like I've just explained, the money the property will yield every year. You discount it back to the present, but you have to discount that back at what we call an interest rate. Again, don't worry too much about this term for now. I will explain in the subsequent sessions. The discounting process simply means that I am and that you are time weighting the cash flow. It means that you are time weighting the cash flow. And you need to time weight the cash flow because you're delaying gratification today, and you should be compensated for the sacrifice that you're making. And that sacrifice needs to be in monetary form, which means that the person who returns the money back to you, if they borrow from you, they need to pay a premium. Likewise, the property that generates a cash flow needs to generate enough of a cash flow such that when it's been discounted back, you are getting more in value than the price you paid. One of the other things we do when we discount is we try to ensure that if there are any losses in relation to the fact that the money devalues itself over time, especially if the money is in a currency form. This is simply due to monetary inflation. Again, going back to the £100 example. £100 in 2021 will not be the same, will not have the same purchasing power or the same buying power as £100 in 2029. And that has to do with so many reasons, mainly fiscal monetary policies that are put in place by the UK government. I hope that makes sense. Now, what this means is that to start the process of valuing a property, the first step is you have to estimate accurately the cash flow, the cash the property will produce. You have to forecast the cash flow because you're projecting into the future. So that's step one. Step two is that once you've determined what that cash flow is, you have to estimate or ascertain the risks associated with the investment. And the best way to do this is by virtue of the interest rate. There are several words that I'm going to use that are synonymous with the word interest rate as we go along in this series. The first is hurdle rate. The second is discount rate. And the third is cost of capital. You're going to find that I will use each of these words interchangeably with interest rates. For the purpose of this conversation, they're all the same, until I expand on where there are variations and where such variations should be applied. Now, cash flow, the risks which you've estimated in the form of one of these. And the third is the time frame. This time frame simply means the period or the duration of ownership of the asset, in this case the property. What this means is if you're buying a property for and you intend to hold the property for 5 years, then your valuation process should take into account the value of the property, the cash flow the property will produce for you in the 5-year period, and then at the end, how much you can sell the property for. On the other hand, if it's for a 10-year period, you find actually the timeline extends. Remember, money depreciates over time. So in 5 years, the value of the property will be more certain than in 10 years because you're going further out into the future. So keep in mind these 3 steps. I know that most home buyers, and if you are one of those, I'm not making a value judgment, but most home buyers do not necessarily consider themselves as investors, especially when they're buying a home. For most people, it's more of a lifestyle choice. I would like you to perhaps to appreciate the significance of the decision you might be making is to consider that the home you purchase is usually the largest financial transaction that you may make in your lifetime. I understand that sometimes people are only using 10% as a deposit for the purchase. So if a property is worth 500,000, they only have to put a deposit down of 50,000. But the property will be bought for 500. Therefore, the loan obtained from the creditor is 450,000. So for that reason, some people just simply focus more on how much they've had to save. And for that reason, it's not unusual to find that most people are not that emotionally attached. And therefore, the idea of considering that decision from an investment lens is not something people relate to. But if you keep in mind that the value of the house or the price you're paying is 500,000, and that over the time period, say a 30-year loan, the bank, for giving you 450,000, will require that at the end of the duration or the period, the bank will require that you pay something sometimes in between 650 and 700,000, because you would have to pay the loan back and you'd have to pay interests. So rather than think of the property purchase as a £50,000 investment on your part, think about it as a £700,000 investment that you're making over a 30-year period. And therefore, it certainly could be, certainly I don't know who you are, but it could be the most important financial transaction that you would be making in your lifetime. Therefore, I'd like you to try not to make the same mistake I see a lot of people make, which is they go through the process of purchasing their home without any financial analysis, with very little professional guidance, for the reason that I gave earlier on, which is that they view the transaction as a lifestyle rather than an investment decision. They see the property as some place to live as opposed to some place that they would make an income from. So keep that in mind. I would like you to think like an investor. And that would mean that whenever you allocate capital, you do so with prudence. That would be my goal, to try and ensure that I provide you with the tools and the skill set to ensure that your decision-making process in relation to capital allocation is prudent. So with that said, one of the things that I like to begin with is to ask a question. The question is simple. What makes a property a good buy? This is a very good question. We have so many properties on the market every day. And what makes a property a good buy? I'll give you three things. These are mine. Preconditions. A property should possess three preconditions before it qualifies as a sound investment. Three things. And I'm going to expand on this much later, once I've gone through markets and I can explain to you how understanding how to read the market can translate into very shrewd investment decisions. But for now, focus on the property itself. The first precondition is the intrinsic value of the property has to be greater than the total purchase cost. There's been I hope you noticed this, a subtle shift in a word that I've used a few times. I didn't say that the intrinsic value should be greater than the price. Although, so far in the series, I have been saying that the intrinsic value and the price, you have to understand the relationship. But when it comes to a purchase, a property could have a value of £500,000, but it could be priced at £400,000. That doesn't make it a good investment, although the value is greater than the price. What makes it a good investment is once you've decided to buy, when you've aggregated the purchase price, plus all of your transaction costs and all of your, you could say, holding costs and repair costs. When you've aggregated everything, that gives you your total purchase cost. If your total purchase cost is still below the intrinsic value, then we say that's a good investment. So in this example, a property can have a price of 400, an intrinsic value of 500, but it might cost you you might have a total transaction cost of £140,000, in which case the overall purchase cost is £540,000, and therefore no longer as attractive as you initially believed. The second thing is what I call good economics. To put it in simple language, reliable, growing cash flow. And it has to be predictable cash flow. And this cash flow has to be protected by what I call sustainable competitive advantages, like barriers to entry. I'm going to cover this as we move forward, but let me explain that very briefly. You have a house on a street, and these are terraced houses, but the street is such that next to the street is a park, a very, very well-known park, and there are no more spaces, there's no more land to build new properties. This would mean that there is a barrier to new construction around that particular location, and therefore, because you have limited possibility for new development, property prices around this area would likely stay competitive and attractive. So as demand rises and supply stays fixed, price has to move up to meet demand. And that's what I mean by good economics. And the third is what I call a sound management plan, which has to be in place if the property is to be held for rental income, or if it's meant to be used as a home. Three simple preconditions. Number one, the property should have an intrinsic value greater than its total purchase cost. It should have good economics, and it should have a simple and a sound management plan. Now, based on the three items I've just explained, this property would be considered a good investment. And the way you analyze and estimate and confirm all three conditions to be present is to calculate the property's intrinsic value. And this can be achieved in several ways. My preference is what I call a rationally and a conservatively estimated value. Rationally calculated, conservatively estimated value. The best way to do this is through a methodology that we call the discounted cash flow method. The discounted cash flow methodology. Which simply looks at the value of the property as being the present value of all of the future cash the property will produce. Very simple, nothing complicated. It's just called DCF. You take all the cash the property will produce every year. If you're holding the property for 5 years, you collect the cash flow every year, and then you discount the property back, the cash flow back to today. It's simply the present value of the future cash. Very simple methodology. Now, you remember I said something about the word estimate. I use estimate simply because the essential point of any property analysis or valuation should be to determine, or rather I should say should not be, to determine exactly what the intrinsic value is. Instead, it should be to establish that there is enough value in the property, that the value in the property is adequate, is sufficient to, remember the example I gave, £50,000 your deposit, £450,000 your loan. So when you're valuing a property, what you're asking is a simple question. I want to establish that there is enough value in the property to protect my creditors, so effectively to protect a mortgage, to protect a loan, but also to protect your deposit. So the question is there enough value here to protect the equity position or the debt position in the property. Or sometimes you're simply trying to determine whether the value is considerably high or considerably lower than the market price. Now, to do this, as I'm sure you would agree, what you need is a range of value. That is more than sufficient. It's a mistake. It's a mistake to think that the intrinsic value of a property is as definite or determinable as the market price. You look on any online property brochure and you see a price. The price is definite and has been determined. Because we estimate the value of a property, what we're looking for is a range of value. And to do that, you simply have to use a discounted cash flow method. But in the few minutes that I have, let me just say this. This methodology or this approach to estimating a property's value requires three things. The first is that in order for you to estimate the value of the asset, you have to know how long you intend to hold the property for, or you need to know the length of the mortgage. Or you could just decide to use an arbitrary time frame. So you could say the time frame is 30 years, that's my mortgage. Or you could say the time frame is 10 years, that's my arbitrarily selected time frame. The second thing, so this is time. The second is the cash flow, which you have to estimate yourself. And then the interest rate that you would apply. I hope as you were listening to me, what came to your mind was that this is something that I covered previously. We've just gone full circle, and I've come back and I've said, yes, you can use the discounted cash flow method, but it has some conditions. In order for you to use this method, you have to first determine the timeline, you have to estimate the cash flow, and then you have to determine the interest rate. Now, I hope that's been useful. I'll stop for now, and when we come back in the next session, I'm going to begin